Hey, what's happening, y'all? Jamixdowns here with Intention Music Tech, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive and covering the ins and outs on how to use an EQ in mastering. And this tutorial is actually going to be part of an entire video series of how to master a song that I'll be rolling out over the course of the next couple months, meaning I'll be releasing individual comprehensive tutorials on every aspect of mastering until the full course is complete. So I'm really excited to kick things off with this tutorial on how to use EQ in mastering, as it's one of the most, if not the most important elements of the entire mastering process. And you'll understand why by the end of this video. So let's get into it. But first, before we get into the tutorial, if you need a professional mix and master and want me to mix your music, go to jamixdowns.com or click the link in the description and follow the fast and easy 3-step process. And remember, all of my mixing and mastering services have a 100% money back guarantee to make sure you're completely satisfied with the final result. So in this tutorial, we're going to look at 4 major topics that need to be covered when using an EQ in mastering, which are number 1, of course, are the fundamentals of using EQ. And number 2, we're going to look at what types of EQs to use. Number 3, we're going to learn how to identify and fix mix problems with an EQ and correct the tonal balance. And number 4, we'll discuss key tips you need to know for the most effective EQ when mastering. Once you have a firm understanding of these topics, you'll be well on your way to knowing exactly how to EQ your masters like a master and consistently get a clean, polished, and perfectly toned sound every time out. Before we get started, it's important to note that this tutorial and this entire mastering program as a whole is for people that have some basic knowledge of mastering and are looking to get serious about learning the subject and take their mastering game to the next level. But if you're new to mastering and haven't really tried your hand at it yet, I really recommend that you check out my video on how to master a song for beginners to get you up to speed with the basics of mastering before you watch this video, in order for you to grasp the concepts better and be able to get the most out of it. And for all you that do have some experience behind you and are ready to step up your mastering game, let's get into it. So like always, the first thing we need to get a grasp on when learning any new skill are the fundamentals. And the first thing we need to look at is, what is the objective of using an EQ in mastering? What are we really trying to accomplish with an EQ? Because once we have a firm understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, then it makes the whole entire process so much easier to approach and to apply. So in mastering, we use an EQ to create clarity in the mix and to achieve a proper tonal balance that will make the song sound great in all playback systems and for all distribution platforms. And the way to achieve this clarity and tonal balance is by making very small incremental adjustments when attenuating our EQ bends. Unlike in mixing, where sometimes drastic EQ boosts and cuts are necessary to get a desired result, mastering requires very little boosting and cutting to get that desired result. In fact, most mastering engineers will tell you that you should never cut or boost more than 3 dB of gain when using an EQ on your master. And if you stick to this general rule of thumb, it'll keep you from making mistakes and getting your masters in a lot of trouble. So keep it subtle, keep it light, and always remember that less is more when it comes to mastering. And this should always keep you on the right track when using an EQ when you're mastering. So now that we understand what our goal is with EQing, now we have to discuss what needs to be done to achieve this goal of clarity and tonal balance in order for our tracks to translate well in all playback systems. And the first thing we're going to look at is identifying issues and how to correct tonal issues. And in order to do this effectively, it's really good practice to sit back and listen to the song a few times to, number 1, get a feel for it, and most importantly, listen to where the balance of the mix might be off and what frequencies need to be addressed. From there, it's good practice to A/B the mix with a reference track and start taking notes on what you believe to be the issues that need to be treated. And from there, you can start addressing the issues one by one. And if you're still in the ear training phase of your development and the issues aren't so easily identifiable, using reference tracks and doing EQ sweeps are extremely effective to help find the problem areas. And like I always say, reference tracks are always going to be your biggest ally when it comes to mastering, to give you a template and a solid guideline for you to follow. So the 6 issues that generally need to be looked at and tackled when it comes to mastering. Number 1 is a thin and tinny sounding mix. Number 2 is if the mix is boomy or heavy on the low end. Number 3 is if the mix sounds dull. Number 4 is if the mix sounds muddy and boxy. Number 5 is if the mix is lacking presence. And number 6 is if the mix is too harsh and too bright on the top end. So let's first look at what to do with a thin sounding mix. So if a mix is sounding thin and tinny, it needs to be addressed in the low or low mid frequencies to thicken it up and make it sound fuller. Now, of course, this is going to vary from track to track, but a safe place to start is boosting in the 500 Hertz range and sweep around there to see what will work best for your specific mix. And just a quick note, harmonic exciters work really well when it comes to boosting any part of the signal when mastering, and can be really effective when it comes to thickening up a mix. And number 2, if the mix is boomy or heavy on the low end, and if this is the case, then it needs to be cut in the 200 Hertz or lower range to get that proper balance back in the mix. Number 3, if the mix sounds dull and could use some air to brighten it up, then you need to boost the higher frequencies with a shelf around 10K. Or again, this is another situation where harmonic exciter can be used, but we'll be discussing and taking a more deep dive into harmonics and mastering in the Using Harmonic Saturation module of this course. So moving on to number 4, if the mix sounds boxy or muddy and is lacking clarity, this is where you need to dip out some low mid frequencies between 150 and 350 Hertz to get rid of that nasty mud we all dread in our mixes. And number 5, if the mix is lacking presence, then you should look to boost in the 2500K range to 5K range to get things like guitars and vocals more present in the mix. Finally, number 6, if the mix sounds too harsh and too bright and it's piercing your ears something bad, then you need to cut anywhere between 3K and 8K to balance out this all-important top end in our mix. And these are the frequency ranges we need to look at very carefully and skillfully to make sure our masters are balanced from a frequency standpoint. So make sure you take the time to study these frequency ranges and train your ears to make it easier to identify the problem frequencies when you are mastering. And an important note to make when cutting frequencies and mastering is to make sure that you use narrow cues when addressing resonance issues and broader cues for tonal shaping. And I talk about this more in the beginner's tutorial of this course, How to Master a Song for Beginners, which you can get the link to right here. So now let's look at the EQ tools we need to use to achieve this tonal balance and clarity that we've been talking about. And if you're at the level of experience to even be watching a tutorial like this, then you know there's a million different EQs out there and a variety of different EQ types. And in this tutorial, we're going to be discussing the different EQ types that should be utilized when mastering your tracks. So we'll be looking at the best type of EQ to use, why mastering EQs are so effective, dynamic EQs, linear phase EQ, and I'll also be touching on my own personal favorite EQs that I like to use when mastering. So first, let's take a look at the best type of EQ to use for mastering. Okay, so the track I'm using for today's tutorial is called BOM, and the group name is Ski Gang, and the artist names are Scoota and Blitz, and this track is on all streaming platforms, and it's also on YouTube. So make sure you go to all streaming platforms and check out the rest of their stuff. All their stuff is fire. These guys are really talented. So the first thing we're going to look at here is the best type of EQ to use. And the best type of EQ to use is an EQ that has the most functionality and which is the most versatile. So, of course, so many people use the Pro Q, and that's the main reason. It has so much functionality. And for mastering, when you have an EQ that has this type of functionality, for one, it helps with your signal chain. If you have an EQ that can do everything, then you don't need to add a bunch of plugins to your mastering chain, and you can save it to add different types of plugins to make your master even better. So what you want to look for in a mastering EQ is something that has mid-side functionality. And then you also want a EQ that has dynamic EQ functionality. And another bonus with a plugin like the Pro Q is that you can add as many bands as you want. A lot of EQs only have a specific amount of bands, and sometimes you need more than that, and then you have to bring in another EQ to make your adjustments. So those are 3 huge reasons why you want a versatile EQ. And then also with this specific EQ, it also has linear phase, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later on in this tutorial. But the best type of EQ to use is something that is versatile, that has dynamic EQ functionality, that has mid-side functionality, and then also it's going to give you a lot of bands to work with. And when you have an EQ like this, it just makes mastering so much easier. You can kind of do it all in one plugin. And I understand that these types of EQs are expensive, and you don't have to use these. I'm just giving you something to work towards when you start mastering, to have an EQ like this. And that's one of the reasons why I am giving away these types of plugins, because I know they're expensive, but I also know how important they are to have in your toolbox. So again, if you guys aren't familiar with me, I do something called give back giveaways, and it's where every month I pick one of my subscribers or somebody who's a subscriber on the website, and I give away software, either a FabFilter plugin, or I give away $250 worth of Plugin Alliance plugins. So make sure you go to the website or subscribe to the channel and be entered to win one of these incredible plugins. So the next thing I want to talk about is why mastering EQs are so effective. And there's a few reasons for this. So most mastering EQs are analog EQs, and with analog EQs, they have broader cues, and this allows you to to shape your tone of your master. And that's one of the big reasons why mastering EQs are so effective. And mastering EQs also, because they're analog, they have built-in saturation, and this saturation also gives it a specific tone that can really sound pleasing to the ear. And the third reason why mastering EQs are so effective is because of their subtle nature. They're designed to be very subtle when you're attenuating and boosting and cutting frequencies. So I'm going to show you an example here. I'm going to pull up one of my favorite mastering plugins, which is the Millennia NS EQ. And I'm just going to show you how subtle this plugin is when I push it. And it doesn't really matter which frequency. I'm just going to push the high end here so you can get an example of what I'm talking about.
Pockets full, I ain't worried. Stomach full, vision blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it.
So as you can see here, I've pushed it up like almost 10 dB. And watch when I A/B it and see how subtle it is pushing it that hard.
Pockets full, I ain't worried. Stomach full, vision blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard.
So of course I've exaggerated. I wouldn't have pushed it that much, but I wanted to show you why mastering EQs can be so effective. They're very subtle. So that's at 10K, and I'm going to cycle through these so you can hear what it sounds like.
Pockets full, I ain't worried. Stomach full, vision blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million and all cash.
So as you can see, I've pushed that really, really high. And in mastering, that is a lot. So it's harder to get yourself in trouble when you're using a mastering EQ. And again, a lot of them have, because they're analog, they have the built-in saturation, and it just gives you specific tone and textures that can sound really pleasing to the ear. So a lot of times when I'm mastering, I definitely have different mastering EQs that I use. And I'm going to actually show you guys some other EQs that I love using when mastering. But this is a great one, the Millennia NS EQ from Brainworks and Plugin Alliance. They did an incredible job. And this is actually, of course, an analog emulation. The hardware is very expensive. I believe it's somewhere in the range of $10,000. But when you are starting to get more serious about mastering EQs, they're made for a reason, and they do have their purpose. But again, you don't have to use mastering EQs, but they can really help with the tonal shaping of your master. And that's why I choose to use mastering EQs a lot. So next we're going to look at using dynamic EQs in mastering. And these can be so important. Depending on what stage you're at in your journey, if you haven't started using dynamic EQs, I hope this tutorial helps you get a glimpse into how powerful they are and to start learning how to use dynamic EQs properly. So the purpose of a dynamic EQ, especially in mastering, is just to tame specific frequencies that you want in certain sections of the song that you don't want to affect other sections of the song with. So for example, in this song, I'm just gonna play it.
Pockets full, I ain't worried. Stomach full, vision blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving.
So in this section, the bass comes in. So just for example, this is a perfect example of where you could use a dynamic EQ. Let's just say that bass was too heavy and you wanted in that section to duck it out, but you didn't want it, you didn't want to take out those frequencies throughout the rest of the track. This is where a dynamic EQ is perfect for a situation like this. So I'm gonna show you what I mean here.
I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I...
So right in this frequency range here, that bass is hitting very heavy.
I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius.
So what dynamic EQ does, just in that section there, and I'm going to tighten up this Q a bit, and I'm going to pull it down, and you'll see how it works here.
I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person.
So there you can see that it's also affecting the kick. So if I shift this down a bit, so I don't want it affecting the kick, just the bass.
I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make... I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth.
Or you could use a shelf.
I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another.
So it's not affecting the kick as much over here if I use the shelf, but you can see what I mean. It's just for specific frequencies. And when you start really getting into the mastering process and using EQ, dynamic EQs can actually come in really handy when you need to get a little more surgical with your stuff. And this can work for any frequency range. And that's why it's really important to use dynamic EQs to have that flexibility. So when you get to a certain level of learning how to master, it's really important that you start to understand and study linear phase EQ. And I'm not going to take a deep dive into linear phase EQ in this tutorial, but I do feel it's necessary to bring awareness and attention to what it is so that you can start to take the time to study it more moving forward. And if you want more information on this, FabFilter actually has an incredible article on linear phase EQ that will definitely help you get up to speed. But I actually found that apple.com had a really good description of what linear phase EQ is, and I quote, "Linear phase EQ uses different underlying technology to channel EQ that preserves the phase of the audio signal. Phase coherency is always maintained even when you apply extreme EQ curves to the sharpest signal transients." So by nature, when you attenuate bands on an EQ, it will start bringing the signal out of phase and can cause an unwanted smearing of your tracks. Now, you definitely don't have to use a linear phase EQ, but mastering engineers tend to use them more because the phase smearing can become more evident in the mastering stage, simply because in mastering, the adjustments you make have such a stronger effect on your overall audio. So let's quickly take a look at FabFilter's Pro Q and go through a quick rundown of the linear phase settings and what they do to give you a better understanding of how to use it. Okay, so now we're gonna look at the linear phase settings in which each of them means and what they do to your audio. So we're gonna use the Pro Q and we are gonna go down here and we're gonna click linear phase. And we have the low, medium, high, very high, and maximum. So low setting, I've taken this actually right from the FabFilter website. So low provides linear phase processing with minimal latency. This should be used exclusively with low Q values or when only affecting the mid-high part of the spectrum. With a sample rate of 44.1 kilohertz, it results in total latency of 3,072 samples, about 70 milliseconds. And if we go to the medium is a good compromise between low frequency resolution and latency. This is the recommended setting for general purpose linear phase processing. The total latency is 5,120 samples at a sample rate of 44.1 kilohertz, which is about 116 milliseconds. And then if we go to high provides great low frequency resolution. If you need to use high Q values, if you need to use high Q values when affecting the low end of the spectrum, use this mode. The total latency is 9,216 samples at a sample rate of 44.1 kilohertz, which is about 209 milliseconds. And then the very high linear phase setting provides even better low frequency resolution. The total latency is 17,408 samples at a sample rate of 44.1, which is about 395 milliseconds. And then the maximum results in the best low frequency resolution at the expense of very high latency and possible pre-ringing problems. The total latency here is 66,560 samples at a sample rate of 44.1, which is about 1,509 milliseconds. So what this means is that the higher you go, the more latency that you can introduce to your signal. So that's why it's good to start with a medium setting, meaning there's a good balance between correcting the phasing and not having too much latency in the signal. So let's just cycle through these in the track and see if you can hear the difference. It's very subtle, but I'm going to boost it a lot here, and I'm going to cycle through these settings to see if we can hear the difference.
I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands, I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million in all cash or $1 million in bank, bro? I need.
See, maximum won't even work. It just stops, as you can see. So it actually does make a big difference when you're going through these phase settings. It is very subtle, but it is something when you are starting to master and learn mastering EQ mastering, you need to start understanding linear phase, as again, it does cause phasing naturally whenever you boost the signal, and linear phase corrects that, but it adds latency to the signal. So while we're covering what types of EQs to use, I'm just going to quickly show you guys the EQs that I like to use when I'm mastering. So number one is the Pro Q, like I explained earlier, because of its versatility. It's just an incredible mastering plugin, just an all-around plugin for everything, really. But because of its versatility, that's always going to be a go-to. And then again, the Millennia NS EQ. This is such an amazing sounding EQ, and not just for mastering, for everything. And I just love how subtle it is, and I love the tone and texture of this plugin. And that's really what I'm looking for with mastering EQs: the subtlety, how hard I can push it, and then the actual tone of the analog emulation. And then also this Meg EQ4, it's not actually a mastering EQ, but I tend to use this a lot for mastering because, again, it actually is very subtle and you can push it. And I just love the tone of this plugin as well. I use it on everything. You know, it's kind of known for being a vocal EQ plugin, but I find it works incredible on mastering, the EQ4 or the EQ2. Great plugin for mastering. And then there's the Knife Soma. This is actually a tube EQ. So it has that tube texture to it. And this is a mastering EQ, and it's also very subtle as well. And this is a plugin from Plugin Alliance. These are all Plugin Alliance plugin to be, by the way. So the Millennia is a Plugin Alliance plugin. The Meg EQ is a Plugin Alliance plugin, and the Knife Soma is a Plugin Alliance plugin. And then last but not least is the Lisa Tomo, and this is also Plugin Alliance plugin. So as you can see, I'm a huge Plugin Alliance fan. And again, I have my monthly giveaways, give back giveaways. So make sure you subscribe either to the YouTube channel or to the website and get access to win some of these incredible plugins. This is a very unique plugin because it's a dynamic analog mastering EQ. So it's very hard to find dynamic EQs that are analog. So that's a huge reason why this is such an incredible plugin. So not only does it have dynamic functionality, but it sounds incredible. And I know it looks like a lot and it looks confusing, but once you start playing around with it, you start getting the hang of it, it's definitely worth it to try this plugin out. So these are the 5 EQs that I like using when I'm mastering. And shoot me a comment and let me know what you guys use. I love to, I always want to learn what all you guys are doing out there and what you guys use and what works for you guys. So shoot me a comment, let me know what EQs you guys like using when you're mastering. So now it's time to look at 7 key, very important tips that you need to know when it comes to using EQ in mastering. And number 1 is using acoustic treatment. So when you get to the stage of the engineer's journey of learning how to master, it's so imperative that the space that you're using to mix and master in is acoustically treated. Now, understand that acoustic treatment ain't cheap, and many of you aren't currently in a position to financially justify spending the money, but I will say this, it's just one of those things that eventually you need to have if you're serious about releasing music. It's the only way to get the accuracy needed to make the correct EQ decisions. So if you don't have acoustic treatment in your space as of yet, reference tracks will be your only saving grace to know you're making the right EQ decisions. And I also want to add that a nice set of studio monitors can go a long way when mastering, but again, I completely understand that this is a budget thing, and as home studio music creators, we have to work with what we have, which is fine, but only as long as your room is acoustically treated and you take the time to learn how to compensate where your current speakers lack in terms of frequency. And I always stress the use of reference tracks and how valuable they are when mixing and mastering, especially when it comes to getting a proper EQ balance. They're just so easy to use. They save you from unnecessary guesswork. They save you from unnecessary frustration that comes from your mixes not translating well. And most of all, they just work. So always use reference tracks when mastering. And there's plenty of A/B software available out there, such as Metric A/B from Plugin Alliance, Isotope Ozone, and many others. And if you currently don't have any A/B software, let me show you the best way to A/B in your sessions when you're mastering. Okay, so I just want to show you guys a quick tip on how to A/B your reference tracks if you don't have A/B software. So I brought in the reference track here. This track is called Glass House, and this is another Ski Gang track. And I can see by accident I brought in the MP3 version, but for the sake of what I'm going to show you, that's actually okay. So normally if you're mastering, you're going to do all of your processing on the mastering track. The problem with that is when it comes to A/Bing. So for example, I have this VMR and I've just brought this in here and I've just dialed in really quick settings. I have some compression, some analog console emulation software, and just some basic EQing and harmonics. And the problem with A/Bing this, so for our track that we're mastering, it's great. But as soon as we go to solo our A/B track, all of the processing that we've done on our master is now going to affect our reference track, and we're just not going to get a proper reference. So when you're A/Bing, for example, say I had all these plugins here and I had processing on all of these plugins. Now what I have to do when I'm A/Bing is bypass all of these plugins and then play this one.
Pass out, smashing on these hoes till I pass out. Wake up to your bitch with an ass out.
And then when I go to A/B it, now I have another step in between and I have to bypass these and then A/B it this way. So it's not very effective when you're A/Bing that way. So make sure when you are using your reference track and you are mastering like this, don't put your processing directly on the master track. Make sure it's actually on the audio track to make the A/B process more efficient. Okay, so now let's quickly talk about signal chain. And signal chain is just as important in mastering as it is in mixing. So when it comes to specifically EQ in your signal chain in mastering, again, it's the same concept that we would use in mixing. So whenever we're doing any type of subtractive EQ, we want to have that first in the chain so that those frequencies aren't affecting the rest of the effects processors that we have after that, like our compression and our distortion, whatever it might be. Any unwanted frequencies we want out of there first, so they don't affect the rest of our master. So, and this is with subtractive EQ. So any type of subtractive EQ you want to put first on your signal chain. And then after that, we can add our compression and distortion. And then when we're doing additive EQ, then we want to actually do that after our compression and any other types of effects, because we don't want those effects affecting what we're boosting. So it's very similar to how I would use a signal chain in mixing. It's actually the same idea when it comes to mastering. So subtractive EQ first, and then if you have compression, you want to bring in some compression, and then say, for example, you want to bring in some lo-fi, you want a lo-fi sound. Once you've done that, then you can start doing the additive EQ, because this lo-fi, just for example, this lo-fi plugin is going to really affect the signal, and whatever additive EQ you've done before that isn't really going to be very effective. So once you've added your other processing, then you do the additive EQ and tone your track once all of your other processing has been done. So this is very key when it comes to signal chain when you're doing your mastering. Subtractive EQ first, and then additive EQ at the end of the chain before you start doing your limiting. Okay, so now let's look at tip number 4. And this is one of my favorite tips, and it's using multiple EQs. And this is something that's definitely a little bit more advanced and requires a little bit more knowledge about EQ, but it's an incredible tip to take with you moving forward. And the reason being is because when you're using analog EQs, they all have different sounds and different tones and textures. So when it comes to tonal shaping, which is a big part of what we're doing with EQ, when you use multiple EQs, it just allows you to shape your tone a little bit more. So for example, the way that I do this is there's different bands of frequencies that I like on specific plugins. So for example, let's just say for this Mog plugin here, I like how it sounds at 20K. So I'm gonna boost this at 20K. And then for example, I'll take the Millennia and say I like how the Millennia sounds at 8K, and I'm gonna boost it at 8K.
Pockets full, I ain't worried. Stomach full, vision blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose.
And then just say, for example, I feel this track needs to be boosted and it needs some presence. Then I can use the Knife Soma because I like this one at 2.7K, and I'm gonna boost this one to give it some presence.
Pockets full, I ain't worried. Stomach full, vision blurry.
So now I'm shaping the tone with 3 different EQs that sound completely different. And now I'm going to A/B these so you can see how all of that sounds.
full, I ain't worried. Stomach full, vision blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million.
So as you can see, it's just helping me shape that tone a little bit differently than just using one EQ. Also too, if you need to push something a little bit more, it's more effective if you use more than one plugin. So say you want to brighten up the track with a shelf, and pushing it too much with a specific plugin that you're using just isn't sounding right. You can bring in another plugin and shelf it at say 10K, and it just won't have that extra exaggerated effect to it if you use multiple EQ plugins. So again, this is something that I do on all of my mastering, and I find it to be really effective, and it's just something great for you guys to look into moving forward with your mastering. Okay, so tip number 5 is to use automation if needed. And this kind of goes hand in hand with using the dynamic EQ. So for example, say you don't have a dynamic EQ or you're not comfortable with using dynamic EQs yet, you can also use automation. So I'm going to use the same example in this track when the bass comes in.
Got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball.
So we're going to use this example in this section. So in Pro Tools, I'm just going to go to my master bypass, and I am going to dip out some of that low end. Let's just say, for the sake, I actually wouldn't dip out low end on this master, but just for the sake of this demonstration, we're going to pull out some low end.
I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little.
So if we wanted to do that, now I can go here to my automation lane and then just bring it in when the bass kicks in.
I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy.
So now I've tucked that frequency range out when the bass comes in.
I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big band.
So you can see that is a technique that can work, and I find that using a dynamic EQ works well here too. But again, certain situations could call for automation, and then certain situations can call for a dynamic EQ. But it's great to know both techniques when you start getting a little bit deeper into mastering. And believe me, this is needed. Using automation and using dynamic EQs is needed more than you think. So this is a very important tip to take with you and keep in mind moving forward, is using automation when mastering. Okay, so tip number 6 is using a frequency spectrum analyzer. And this is just something that's really good habit. It's more of a habit thing that you want to get into when you're mastering, because it just helps you see how you're shaping your master with your EQ. So I'm going to pull in the adapter metric AB plugin, and there's free spectrum analyzers out there. You definitely don't have to use this one, but what it does is it allows you to see the frequency balance within your master, and it can give you some areas to look at visually that might need some attention. So I'm just going to play this track so you can see.
Blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? I mean,
so as you can see right around here in the 400 range, it's spiking up quite a bit. So that could be something that we might want to treat with an EQ. So
blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth.
I'm actually just going to bring in another EQ for this. I'm going to bypass this one.
Blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do.
So that boxiness, there's some boxiness in there that we just might want to take out of the mix a little bit.
Blurry. I got it on me, never nervous. Stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million in all cash or me?
So you can see that did actually clean it up there in the mid range a bit. So that's why using frequency spectrum analyzers can come in really handy. And again, there are free ones out there. You don't have to use this one, but it really helps in mastering to visually see. Of course, you're mainly listening, but it sometimes helps to have a visual representation of what you're seeing to make sure that your EQing is balanced. Okay, so tip number 7 is using mid-side processing. And this actually isn't a tip. This is definitely a big-time technique, and we've saved the best for last here. So mid-side processing is a very important aspect to mastering and using EQ in mastering. And there's a lot of reasons, but there's 3 main reasons why we use mid-side processing and the benefits of using mid-side processing. One is that it can widen the stereo image, and all you have to do is just add a touch of shelving in the higher frequency range, and I'm going to show you how all this works. Number 2, it can tighten up the low end by reducing frequencies below 75 hertz and reducing the side frequencies. And number 3, it can add more definition to vocals without affecting the rest of the mix too much. So I'm going to show you exactly how this works. We're going to continue. I'm actually just going to pull this over here. Yes, that's okay. And I'm going to get rid of this automation. We don't need it for this. And we go back to our factory defaults. So the first thing that I'm going to do is show you how to clean up the low end. And what we want to do is to use a high pass filter, but use it just affecting the sides.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy.
Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at here is using a high pass filter to clean up the lows. And what we want to do is go anywhere between have a slope 48 dB or 72 dB, and make sure that we have our band set to side. And what we're doing is we're taking all the side information out of the low end, and I'm going to show you how this works.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Never nervous, stack it.
I thought I got rid of that. We got to get rid of that. There we go.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these.
So general rule of thumb when you're cleaning up the low end in this way, essentially you're making the low end in mono. So everything below these frequencies is now monoed. And I'm going to A/B it so you can see how it's cleaning it up. And again, general rule of thumb here, you don't want to go really any lower than 40 hertz or any higher than maybe 80 or 90 hertz when you're using this technique.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little.
And what this does is just make room for all that low end information and any side information that got into the signal that we don't necessarily need there. It just cleans it up and makes everything in the low end a lot clearer. And this is such a huge technique, and it's not something that you necessarily need to do on every track, but it's something that you should play around with to see if it helps with cleaning up your track. And again, this is as far as how much to take out, it's going to depend, on, track to track, on a track to track basis. But it really, really helps clean up the signal. Next, we're going to look at how using mid-side widens gives you a perception of widening the stereo field when you boost the highs with a shelf. And again, we're going to just boost the sides here, none of the mid information.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it?
So I'm going to exaggerate it here and A/B it so you can hear the difference.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million in all cash or $1 million in the bank, bro? I need it in my reach while dripping in a meat coat. Teach my niggas to get more but never turn hoe. And even when you're slipping, always stay on your toes. Money talks every language, act like you know. It's a
So as you can see there, it just gives that perception of being wider because we're brightening all of the side information. And depending on how you're listening to this, whether you're in headphones or in a set of studio monitors, you're definitely going to be able to hear how much a difference that makes. And this is just a cool little technique that you can use just to make your master sound a little bit wider without having to do too much extra. So these are great techniques. And then the last technique we're going to look at is being able to boost the vocal and give it presence without affecting too much the rest of the mix too much, as we're only going to be boosting the mid channel. And again, this is why I love using this plugin. Because it has all this functionality and it's just really easy to use. So I'm going to bring in a new band and I'm going to put mid band. So now this band is just affecting all of the middle information.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million in all cash or $1 million in the bank, bro? I need it in my reach while dripping in a meat coat. Teach my niggas to get more but never turn hoe. And even when you're slipping, always stay on your toes. Money talks every language, act like you know.
So I'm going to show you the difference of doing it this way than just doing it with the stereo. So I'm going to A/B between the mid and the stereo.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million in all cash or $1 million in the bank, bro? I need it in my reach while dripping in a meat coat. Teach my niggas to get more but never turn hoe. And even when you're...
So as you can see, it's just subtle differences. We're using the mid band in a situation like this because we're just not pulling up all of the samples and everything else that's kind of spread out. We're just kind of focusing. In this situation, the hi-hat is in there as well. So we're boosting the hi-hat, which would have to be treated a little bit differently. But this is just an example of the power of using mid-side when you're mastering. So again, just to recap, it can help clean up the low end when we model the low end. It can help widen the stereo field without using stereo with plugins. And it's such a really cool technique that I love using. And then also it can brighten up things within the mid channel or take out things in the mid channel. This isn't just for boosting. This also works for cutting certain information that might need to be cut out of the signal. So mid-side processing is a huge aspect to using EQ in mastering. Okay, so now that we've covered all these techniques and all these different things to look at and understand when it comes to using an EQ in the master, I just want to do a quick A/B test on how I would EQ this track so you can see the power of doing effective EQ in mastering. So I have this ProQ plugin going here, so I'm going to keep this processing and just kind of go through this quickly for you guys so you can get an idea of how powerful these techniques are when we apply them.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million in all cash or $1 million in the bank, bro? I need it in my reach while dripping in a mink coat. Teach my niggas to get more but never turn hoe. And even when you're slipping, always stay on your toes. Money talks, every language, act like you know. It's the respect and the principle. Plus when you're broke, you don't get no love. Nigga, that's how shit go. Right now, nigga, up, I'm in my mode. No looking down, it's levels to this shit. Straight out the mud I rose. Bands on. Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million in all cash or $1 million in the bank, bro? I need it in my reach while dripping in a mink coat. Teach my niggas to get more but never turn hoe. And even when you're slipping, always stay on your toes. Money talks, every language, act like you know. It's the respect and the principle. Plus when you're broke, you don't get no love. Nigga, that's how shit go. Right now, nigga, up, I'm in my mode. No looking.
Okay, so I've just done some really quick tweaks here, but I just want to show you the power of using all of these techniques and A/B, how this sounds.
Never nervous, stack it and bag it up, it's the only purpose. Ball hard, smooth nigga, Julius Irving. Big bands while I do little Eddie Murphy. Understand these bands make you another person. Is it all worth it? What you think though? $1 million in all cash or $1 million in the bank, bro? I need it in my reach while dripping in a mink coat. Teach my.
So now we've got a nice, as you can see, the clarity is there. Nothing's really poking out of the mix too much. The balance is there. And we've all done this essentially with just EQ. So you can see the power of starting to understand how important EQing is to mastering and how we can get that balance to make our tracks translate well in all playback systems. And that's the ultimate goal here, is clarity, tonal shaping, to make sure our tracks are sounding good in all playback systems. So again, I hope this tutorial was really helpful for you guys. Make sure you drop a comment. I want to know what type of EQs you guys like when you're mastering. And I want to know what type of other techniques that you guys are using as well, because these are just, you know, some techniques that I use and that I've picked up over the years, but there's always more to learn. And also make sure that you subscribe to the channel and or the website, preferably both, and make sure your name gets thrown into the hat and be able to win some of these plugins that I've been using in this tutorial. Again, we do a draw every month. It's called Give Back Giveaways, and you can either get a plugin from FabFilter, or you can get $250 worth of plugin, Alliance plugin. So make sure you do that, and I'll see you guys on the next tutorial.